Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Not Another F1 Blog. In this episode I'll be focusing mainly on two things. I'd like to talk about some of the changes that have contributed to more exciting racing this year, such as the introduction of the drag reduction system and the switch to Pirelli tyres, but first, I'd like to say a few things about the penalties given to Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso after the Malaysian Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton received a 20-second penalty for changing direction more than once when he was defending from Fernando Alonso on the main straight. This dropped him from 7th position to 8th in the final standings. Looking at replays of the incident, it is clear that Hamilton did indeed change direction more than once, but not in a manner that could be considered to be dangerous, and so this incident seemed to be marginal. However, the fact that Hamilton had previously been warned about weaving after the incident with Petrov at last year's Malaysian Grand Prix probably counted against him. Had the incident with Alonso been his first weaving incident, it is possible that he may not have been penalised and could simply have received a reprimand. Fernando Alonso also received a 20-second penalty for causing a collision with Lewis Hamilton while the two were fighting for position. I find it very difficult to see the justification for this penalty, because Alonso's driving didn't seem particularly reckless or anything. It just seems as though he simply misjudged the position of his car relative to Hamilton's. The other reason why it seems harsh to penalise him for it is because he had only ruined his own race by causing the collision. This incident also highlighted another disadvantage of post-race time penalties, and it turned out that Alonso did not lose anything in the final standings. The problem is that post-race 20-second time penalties are not a fair and consistent method of punishment. They depend too much on external circumstances. For example, at Petrov's later incident caused the safety car to be brought out, both Alonso and Hamilton would almost certainly have been dropped out of the points altogether. If grid penalties were to be used instead, then we would avoid this problem. Following the incident, some McLaren fans started complaining about what they perceived to be favouritism towards Ferrari. Personally, I don't buy this, partly because I found Alonso's penalty to be the harsher of the two, despite it not changing the end result. The other reason why I won't buy it is because much of the complaining has been coming from people with a rather skewed perception of Formula 1. Let us consider a hypothetical scenario in which the collision incident takes place exactly as it did in Malaysia, but with the positions of Alonso and Hamilton reversed. I would be willing to bet good money that these same people would have been complaining that it was just a racing incident, and about how penalising Hamilton for causing the collision was clear evidence of Ferrari favouritism, even if Hamilton did not lose any positions in the final standings as a result. Now, let us move on to the changes for this year. So far, it seems as though the racing this year has been much more exciting than it has been in previous years. For this, I would like to thank Pirelli. Having a soft tyre that does not last the full race distance has definitely improved the quality of the racing, as tyre degradation has been a much more important issue than it was last year. I can think of two main downsides to this. The first is the abundance of marbles on the track, especially towards the end of a race, and the second is that pit stop phases have become a lot more difficult to follow. The second of these isn't really Pirelli's fault, but the BBC and other broadcasters could help by regularly showing us how many stops each driver has made out of their expected number of scheduled stops once this is known. As for Pirelli, they could improve their tyres by making them degrade in smaller pieces, but overall I'm pleased with what they've done. The DRS has been somewhat more controversial, especially with the regulations as to where it can and cannot be used during the race. These have drawn some criticism, but I do think there need to be some restrictions if the system is to work, otherwise one driver will just use it to attack and the other will use it to defend. What should the regulations be? Well, I think it was unrealistic to expect the FIA to get it right the first time, given their lack of experience with the system. They'll need to try things out for a few more races to see what works and what doesn't, and we'll need to give them time. What I would like to see, though, is more than one section at the track where it can be used, especially on longer circuits such as Spa. Then there's the return of KERS, which seems to have been somewhat overshadowed by the DRS and Pirelli tyres. However, it does seem to be working better this time round than it did in 2009. The main problem we had the first time round was that a car with the system could easily use it to hold a much faster car without the system at bay for a very long time. That hasn't been happening this time, since it isn't just a couple of teams that have been using it. It's interesting that Red Bull have been doing well despite their problems with the system. Is it not actually that important, or have they just produced a car great enough to compensate for it? It's also worth noting that 2 of the 3 races so far, and in my opinion the best 2, have been on tracks designed by Hermann Tilke. To me, that suggests that some of the flack that Tilke has been receiving over his track designs has been undeserved, although it remains to be seen whether the changes can save the tracks that are generally seen as his worst ones, in particular the ones at Valencia and Abu Dhabi. Some Formula 1 fans have been complaining that the overtaking generated is too artificial and therefore boring. I can understand these complaints when they relate to gimmicks that are introduced specifically to introduce overtaking, such as the DRS, especially with all the rules that go with it, but still, I would take these any day over boring procession trains. What I do not understand, however, is that people have been crying that the overtaking generated by the Pirelli tyres is also too artificial for their liking. If people are going to complain about that, then the chances are that they're going to complain about any change to the cars that is going to facilitate overtaking. What they really want to see is overtaking moves that are generated by the drivers alone, but the fact is that unlike GP2 drivers and the Formula 1 drivers of 30 or 40 years ago, today's Formula 1 drivers are so complete and professional that they are not going to make very many mistakes that will result in another driver overtaking them. That's just a fact of life that we're going to have to live with, whether we like it or not. These people might as well be clamouring for triangular flags with 4 sides. I'll see you again for episode 10. Until then though, that's it. Have a nice day.